Has the UK Mobility Scheme gone too far? Are taxpayers getting good value for money? Are people ripping off the scheme? Are people involved in the charities taking too much money out and not leaving enough money in? The mobility scheme in the UK is taking a lot of flack at the moment. It's all over the internet. The governments are talking about it, the media's talking about it, and for good reason. However, today what we're going to do, as a humble car dealer, I have some knowledge about this. I'm going to talk about what the mobility scheme is, why it was set up, when it was set up, who it affects, who it benefits, and who pays, because this is big news at the moment, and quite frankly, I don't think we're getting enough of the facts here. So sit back, relax, get yourself a tea or a coffee while we deep dive into the UK mobility scheme and see whether or not it is indeed this big scam and corrupt system that people keep on talking about. Okay, so before we go into all the big headlines that are kicking off in the press at the moment, let's talk about where the mobility scheme actually started from and why it started. So back in the 1970s, I know it's gone on for that long, the mobility scheme was essentially a way of ensuring that disabled people, those without the means of travel, were able to get around a bit more. Now back in the 70s it wasn't a very efficient way of doing it, so essentially they were putting people that are unable to travel into very small cars, single seaters, and it was just a way of making sure they can get to the shops. Now unfortunately that just wasn't working, and by the mid-70s they decided that it needed a total reform and they needed some sort of a way of making sure that people that were less able were able to get about with their families or whatever it might be, and therefore the government introduced the mobility scheme. And essentially what that did was allow people to lease cars using their benefits in order to be more mobile. And I think anyone in the right mind has got to be a massive advocate for that scheme. Now fortunately things have changed and it has become a huge business. And what we're going to do now is talk about how it's actually set up and the workings of it in the background. So in 1977, Mobility was set up as an independent charity, and it was to create a practical scheme enabling people to use their mobility allowance to get a car or other mobility vehicle, for example a scooter. Now the charity was founded with cross-party support, which is rare, and led by figures including the late Lord Goodman and Geoffrey Lord Sterling. By 1978, Mobility Operations, which is a commercial company, was created to run the operational side of the scheme, so that's leasing, fleet purchasing, insurance, servicing, and the remarketing of vehicles. Whilst the charity, so Mobility Foundation, provided an oversight, advice and grant making where needed. Now the first customer vehicle handovers took place in July 1978, and the small first group of customers were publicly handed their keys at Earl's Court. From the start, the model was customers exchanged their qualifying weekly mobile benefit for a lease package that includes a vehicle, insurance, servicing and breakdown cover, and it makes motoring simpler and more affordable for those who need it. Now why was it set up as a charity and a commercial split? Well, the split, i.e. a charity overseeing it and a commercial operator running the leasing, allowed Mobility to negotiate the fleet prices with the manufacturers and provide a secure, managed lease product for customers, including insurance and adaptations, etc. They would hold the funds and reserves as the operating company for commercial risk and fleet financing, where the charity would raise grants and guide the policy. The public-private partnership approach is what led to the scheme scaling rapidly. Now, there's a lot of milestones that were hit along the way. So in the 1970s, that's when people first started getting the keys. And it was reported by 1998 that over 1 million vehicles have been supplied via the mobility scheme. Then you fast forward to 2010 to 2020 and there were multiple millions of vehicles and it had become Europe's largest fleet operator. So this thing was becoming somewhat of a beast. Now unfortunately, with all businesses and all big companies and all big institutions that become so big, there becomes a lot of people watching what's going on. Now by March 2018, Mobility Operations had reported they had reserves of £2.6 billion sat in cash reserves. Now obviously this spiked the interests of lots of government officials, and as a result of which there's been a lot more scrutiny and red tape within the structure and how it has been operating as essentially a business. Now this is where it's starting to become more something that the media are interested in reporting on, because now we're talking about big money and now we're talking about essentially taxpayer money. So this is where the critique has started to happen of mobility operations. But what we are going to do now is we're going to talk about how it actually affects the user, what it actually looks like to receive one of these cars and how much you're likely to be paying for it. Because again, that's something that is receiving a lot of scrutiny. So as a mobility customer, what you're essentially doing is you are converting your weekly benefit and you're converting that into a lease payment. So those payments will go towards the cost of leasing a vehicle over usually a 3-year period. Now we know about this because we bought cars from auction before that are 3 years old and are what are called ex-Motab cars, so they've come off the mobility scheme. So what does the cost to the user actually look like? So what we're going to do now is talk through some actual numbers as to what it might look like if you are getting a car through the mobility scheme. The standard higher rate mobility payment commonly used on the scheme is around about £77 a week. So when you work that out across the year and over a 3-year lease plan, £77 a week is around about £4,000 a year, and then over a 3-year period is near enough £12,000. These payments are taken from the customer's benefit, and the paid to mobility is the lease consideration, i.e. that's what the customer's allowance covers. Next point is where it starts to get a little bit messy, because what you can do is if you're not happy with the type of car that you've been offered on mobility scheme, you can opt for something a little bit more luxurious. And this unfortunately is what the media is all over like a rash at the moment. And what that essentially means is that you can make an advanced payment. It's a one-off, non-refundable payment, and that basically means that it covers any car on the scheme that the allowance doesn't cover. So for example, you might pay 500 quid as an advanced payment. So your total outlay would start at £500 and then your weekly allowance will pay the lease. Now if you choose a high-end model, it could be an £8,000 advance payment. So you pay £8,000 up front and then your weekly allowance during the lease. Now there's lots of optional extras that you can get involved in as well, so sat-nav, larger batteries on EVs, and bespoke adaptations above standard. Now, if the car's returned with damage beyond fair wear and tear, customers may owe repair costs. And Mobility publishes the return guidance on this, and some advance payments can reduce the end of lease charges. Now, at this point, it's easy to look at this scheme and kind of go, this sort of makes sense. So if you want something a little bit more luxurious and you've got the means to pay for it, then why not? Unfortunately, it's facing scrutiny because people are saying, well, hang on a minute, you're already getting a benefit for this. Why are you benefiting even more out of the scheme? And I'm going to explain to you in pounds and pence why that is starting to ruffle a lot of feathers. So let's have a look at a quick example. So you want to take a BMW 3 Series, which is an example that is from the scheme listings, but it's classed as a luxury option. You might need to make an advance payment of the car, call it £8,000. So there's no extra weekly cost above and beyond your benefit, and the duration is over 3 years. So you've got your initial payment or your advance payment of £8,000 to kick off with, that's a one-off, and then you've got your £77 times by 52 weeks is £4,000 for the year. Over a 3-year lease is £12,000 plus your initial 8 is giving you £20,012. Let's just call it 20 grand to keep things simple. Now, that's obviously more expensive because it's a more luxurious car, but it does include insurance, servicing, breakdown cover tyres and adaptations as well. Now, some adaptations you'd expect to include because you need them to be able to physically drive, but this is adaptations above and beyond you might pay for. Now, the other thing that's annoying people with the luxury element of this is that the insurance costs are going to be higher, and that is a bit of a hidden extra that no one's talking about. If you were to do a private lease on that car, and just to use an example, so this is someone who's not part of the scheme, you might have a £3,000 initial rental, it's £600 a month over 3 years, so 600 times 36 plus your 3 grand is going to cost you £24,600. So it is more expensive for somebody who isn't on the scheme. And there's reasons for that because there's lots of different things that the government incentivises. So there are no insurance premium tax to pay, there's no VAT to pay, etc. So it is heavily subsidised by the taxpayer. This is where it starts to get a little bit frustrating and where arguments start to arise. Now, the other problem with a private lease, of course, is that somebody isn't paying your insurance for you. So you've got your insurance on top, which might be, I don't know, 900 quid a year or 500 quid a year. And then you've got your servicing on top, breakdown, etc. Now, if you do a private purchase, then same car might be 43 grand new, depreciates by 50% over 3 years. So you're losing 21.5 grand plus 2.5 grand in insurance and servicing. So again, it's costing you more if you're buying it outright. Obviously, you're making savings on interest, etc. But pounds and pence cost to a user that's not on the mobility scheme is more expensive. And this is where it's starting to get some real bad traction in the media, and we'll go on to that in a second. What I want to do now is talk about how much the UK government is funding this scheme by, because this is where the numbers combined with this luxury element start to ruffle feathers. Let me just explain that. So these are some of the headline figures that people are seeing, and this is why I'm guessing people are starting to get upset. And the reason I'm doing this video is because I am seeing lots of this on social media where I'm on some sort of Facebook groups, etc., and people are arguing it is a really, really important subject to some people. And there's kind of more to it as well, because it's not just about the money, it's about whether or not people are actually entitled to this in the first place. And I think that's what's really kicking it off. But I've watched these threads and they are going at each other. It's becoming somewhat barbaric. So I'm just hoping that I can help with some genuine numbers here. However, talking about genuine numbers, how is this funded by the taxpayer? Well, it kind of is and it isn't. So it's not directly funded by the taxpayer. So the government doesn't write a cheque every year to the mobility operations company and via the charity and say this is going to fund that. But what they do is they offer quite significant tax breaks and incentives. And as a result of which, the cost to the UK taxpayer by having no insurance premium tax and a reduction in VAT as well can work out into the hundreds of millions of pounds a year. For example, the figures were quoted in 2018 at being £888 million for the year is the true cost to the taxpayer. Now, as a working person in the UK, you feel like that's your money, and I can see why people are getting a little bit disgruntled by that situation. However, there is a counter to this. So mobility operations as a business, as an enterprise, are also creating tax revenue, and they've reported revenues of around about 700 to 750 million pounds a year, which is done through employing staff, through purchasing products, whatever it might be. So they are actually in turn contributing back into the economy as well. So there's an argument that it's sort of a zero effect, nearly. I mean, we're arguing over 100 million quid here, so, you know, who's splitting hairs? However, when you look at the controversies, there is more and more problems that are deriving from this. So, for example, there are misusages of the system. So, with the mobility scheme, you can often get more than just yourself as a named driver on these cars. Sometimes it can be up to 2 or 3 different family members. And there is an argument some of these cars are not being used appropriately for the right reasons. So for example, it is to make able somebody who is not able to be able to move from place to place. That is essentially what the mobility scheme is all about. But when it turns out that the brother who is perfectly able is driving around the car to the kids' football matches, that's where it starts to ruffle feathers with the taxpayer who are funding the scheme. Now, there's more to it than that. So essentially what happened, there was a big review into this and there have been lots and lots of cases unearthed where this is going wrong. So for example, and quote some figures, there's been around about 36,000 cases of suspected misuse that were investigated one recent year, and around about 5,300 people were removed from the scheme. Some vehicles have been reported as used mainly by family members who weren't disabled, who have been seen as being driven for totally unrelated daily errands. So there's obviously the kick-off with whether or not it's been actually fair usage on the cars, and then you've got the fact that there is this tax money going into the system, whichever way you want to dress it up, and then you've got on top of that the fact that people can opt for a luxury vehicle if they want to opt for it. So you can see this is the perfect storm for the media to get involved and start having a kick-off. Now what's more, and to add even more controversy on this, back in 2017 the CEO of Mobility Operations was reported to have taken a total remuneration package of £1.7 million. And that is enough to ruffle the feathers of anybody who's getting tax taken out of their wages, isn't it? So you've again got all these different layers of problems. Now in the headlines recently there's been lots about this, and that's the reason I wanted to do this video. So obviously we have got a pending and dooming budget coming at the end of November, and they're talking about what can and can't happen, or what might or might not happen with the mobility scheme. For me, if you'd like my opinion, which I'm going to give you anyway, I think it's a fantastic scheme, and I think it's absolutely necessary to make sure that people are taken care of that can't take care of themselves, and that is the whole point of the benefit system. Unfortunately, has it grown to a point where it is being manipulated and used by people, and often this happens with benefits, we know this, don't we, that it's not always cut and dry and going to the right people, but has it got to a point where actually the burden on the taxpayer is becoming something that's worth looking at by the government? I don't know. I mean, it certainly appears that way, doesn't it, when you look at the news articles? So I'm hoping that this gives you a bit of an insight into how the scheme operates, how it started. Obviously, it's got its failings and fundamental flaws within it as well, but I'm hoping that this might just iron out some of the arguments that I'm seeing online and give you a bit of a better understanding as to how it actually works and why it's there in the first place. Do I think that you should be able to pay for a luxury car on the mobility scheme? Jury's out on that one. Just because you're disabled, that doesn't mean you shouldn't be able to have a luxury car. I think the big problem with that one is the fact that because the insurance is free and the servicing costs are free and all that sort of stuff, that costs increase outside of just this advance payment that you pay at the start. And that's where I think the whole system starts to become a little bit biased. What's going to happen moving forward? I don't know. They're probably going to have to do something about it. Whether or not it's going to be qualifying people better to go into the scheme, or whether or not it's going to be an additional charge for people who are wanting luxury cars in the scheme, I don't know what it's going to look like. But one thing's for sure, this is a huge business, and it is definitely getting some of the spotlight at the moment by the media and by the politicians. So it's not going to be the last that you hear of this. There's probably going to be loads more coming out in the future. However, for a business that is contributing to, they quote, 1 out of every 5 new cars in the UK, as a car dealer, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens here, because if they start to reduce that number of cars that are being provided to people that most need them, that's going to reduce the amount of stock that's coming my way. And is that going to increase the price of used cars? I don't know. The ripple effect from this, I think, might be quite profound. Hopefully you found that interesting. I know it's a little bit of a different one because it's actually been educational and somewhat serious. However, we'll be getting back to more stupid stuff later on, I'm sure. It'd be really interesting to know your thoughts and your feedback on this. Please keep it clean in the comments. I know that some people have got some pretty fierce opinions on this one, but it'd be nice to get your opinion as to what might have gone wrong here and what might change in the future. But until next time, I hope you found that interesting. I certainly have, and I feel better for knowing. I hope you do too. Cheers.